I'm Steve Mann and this is Paper Classroom. Welcome to another history tutorial. In this particular tutorial we're going to talk about Western raw materials from around about the end of the 1400s to mid 1850s. Now of course in the previous video we talked about the Muslim Empire and the Chinese Empire clashing and that resulted in the secret of paper making coming out of China, and the Samarkand area became the centre of paper making for the non-Chinese. Of course, in the Samarkand area, they didn't grow bamboo, they didn't grow mulberry trees, and so they looked at the raw materials that they used and grew and were plentiful. And the two crops that they did grow a lot of in that area, in the Samarkand area, was hemp and flax. Hemp for making ropes because of its extremely long fibre length, and flax for making clothing, linen. And on the topic of clothing, they could also use old clothing, and they used to have these things called rag shops or rag houses, where they would collect old clothing, cut off the buttons and throw them away, cut up the bits of no longer needed clothing into small bits of rag, and then sending it off to be pounded in the stamp mills. If we move along now to 1666, one of the things that was one of the most prominent events in 1666 in the UK was the burning of London, or known as the Great Fire of London. This was a fire that started in Pudding Lane and destroyed most of London, and it also put an end to something that we call the Black Death or the Great Plague that was rife in Europe for 100 years or so. Now this was an interesting time, and sometimes paper makers were actually blamed for the spread of this plague, and you might wonder why. Well, as you saw in the previous slide, one of the raw materials for making paper was old clothing. So paper makers, being as they are, when they heard someone had died because of the plague, their first thought was not, oh dear, what a shame, poor people. Their first thought was, oh, they won't need the clothes anymore, I can have them. And so they would often go and rob the corpses, steal their clothes, and take the clothes off to the paper mill. So they strip the body, they put it on a hand cart, they trundle through the streets on the way to the mill. But of course, the body or the victim was probably infested with the fleas that actually caused the plague. So as they're taking those clothing through the streets, the fleas would be jumping out of the clothes and jumping onto the people who would become the next source of raw material. So not really a nice thing to think about, but it was a fact. Another event that happened in 1666, the English Parliament produced what was called the Burials in Woolens Act, and this was a law that forbid the burial of corpses in anything other than wool. Now in those days it was tradition that when someone died they were buried in a long flowing garment made of linen, a shroud in fact. So they were buried in this shroud made of linen, and linen comes from flax. We saw in an earlier slide how flax is very good paper making material. So the paper makers, having stripped the poor victim of their clothes shortly after death, waited until they were buried and then dug them up and stole the shroud, because that was a fantastic source of raw material for the mill. While they were there, they also used to pull out the teeth and sell it to the people who practiced dentistry for making false teeth. So this was a sight often seen in cemeteries late at night when no one was around, the people digging up the bodies just to steal the shroud and the teeth. Now, interestingly, one of the people who were keen to promote the burials in Woolens Act was the Bishop of Norfolk. And the Bishop of Norfolk, surprise, surprise, had many, many flocks of sheep. So he actually had a vested interest in wool being the only material allowed for shrouds. Shortly after this time, when we get to the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, and Francis Drake went out to discover America, discovered things like the potato and cotton. And cotton also became a staple raw material for the making of paper. So we had hemp, we had flax, and we had cotton. And we could either use the raw fibre as it was, or we could wait until it became some discarded clothing and then use the discarded clothing. If we move along a little more now to 1719, there was a French naturalist, René de Rima, and one of the things he noticed and wrote a book on it was about wasps landing on dead trees, biting chunks out of the dead wood, chewing it, going away, and building their wasp nest. Now, if you've watched all the videos in this series, you'll remember in one of the earlier videos, I did tell you that the wasp was the very first paper maker 60 million years BC. Well, René de Rima confirmed this. 1719, he actually wrote, I wonder if one day we will be able to make paper from trees as the wasps do. Later on, in 1765, 1771, in that area, Jacob Schaefer wrote 6 books all about different fibres that might be used for paper making. Because what was happening in the world, there was an increasing demand for more and more paper, but the raw material levels were constant. So there was becoming a danger that the demand would exceed the supply. So one of the things that Jacob Schaefer did was he examined many, many different fibres and gave his opinion over these 6 years on how suitable they would be for making paper. One of my personal favourite characters around this time was a guy called Matthias Coops. And in 1800, he wrote a book and he said the future of paper making was wheat straw. Now, in that time, England was a very agricultural country. We were growing huge amounts of wheat, and of course you chop off the head of the wheat for turning it into flour for bread and things like that. But the stalk had absolutely no value and it was just burned in the fields. And Matthias Coops saw this as an opportunity. It's the waste material from one process. Could that be the raw material for another process, paper making? So he wrote a book saying yes, it was. He then actually, after he'd written the book, he then actually had a go at that, making paper, and found he couldn't make paper from wheat straw. One of the reasons for not being able to make paper from wheat straw is wheat straw contains lots of silica. And silica is bad for 2 things. One thing is it makes it very, very difficult to drain water away. So it was difficult to drain the water through the wire when you were casting the sheet of paper, and it was difficult to dry. But once it had dried, silica, it's just like sand. So it was incredibly abrasive. So whatever you used to cut the paper was blunted in no time. So Matthias Coops, having failed at that, rewrote his book in 1801 and reissued it and said, I know what the future of paper making is. The future of paper making is using old paper, which is what the Japanese did in, 1070 something. Yes, so in 1801, Matthias Coops had, 800 years after the Japanese, had the same idea. Why don't we use old paper for making new paper? again, that's limited to the amount of paper that's there. So people were exploring other fibres and exploring what to do with them and how to make them useful. And in 1840, Friedrich Keller, a German inventor, actually invented a wood grinding machine. He was eventually bought out by a company called Voith. Many of you paper makers may know Voith. So this is just one of the many designs of log grinding. So these little circles here represent logs, so trees. So these rams push the tree against this rotating grinding wheel, and it effectively rips out all the fibres. And you've then got what we call a mechanical pulp, and we'll talk about mechanical pulps later on. So he thought that was a great idea, and what he did with it then, he made all these individual fibres, and he thought, who can I sell them to? And he went along to a local paper mill that made newsprint. He thought that was the best option, and he offered this newsprint mill his mechanical fibre made from grinding trees. And amazingly, at almost exactly the same time, in Canada, Charles Fernetti did exactly the same. He thought, maybe I can make wood from trees. He built a log grinding machine, produced the mechanical fibre. What did he do with it? He went along to his local mill that made newsprint and said, would you like to buy my fibre? So, very strange, what a coincidence. And finally, just as we leave this section, just a reminder, again, I mentioned it in an earlier video, Augustus Stanwood, seeing that people were running out of raw materials, commissioned some ships to go over to Egypt and bring back mummies. He set up a big warehouse in Maine, and he had people unravelling the mummies. And a typical everyday person with no particular status in the Egyptian society, there was about 14 or 15 kilos worth of bandages in this mummy. And of course, as you went up in society and became more and more noble, then you were wrapped in more layers of bandages. So he brought the mummies over, unravelled the bandages, burned the body to keep all his workers warm, and the bandages were then sold to a local mill that made food wrapping paper and butcher wrap. Anyway, he had several outbreaks of cholera amongst his workers. Some people say the cholera came from the mummies, but it's very unlikely that a cholera virus or germ will last thousands of years. It's more likely the unsanitary conditions in which he kept his workers. Anyway, that's the end of this particular video tutorial. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Please enjoy our other videos and please give us some feedback. Thank you for your time and attention.